All right, welcome back, everybody. Day 3 of the National Rural Housing Conference, and we are in the home stretch. So let's take a minute or two to go over today's agenda. Today we host 2 main events, Nuts and Bolts. It's a conference staple, and the closing plenary focusing on the latest data from rural America with HAC's own Lance George. The plenaries of the last couple of days have pushed us pretty hard to get to think big, stretch, put our work in a larger context. Today's program is going to zoom us back in, getting deeply into the details that matter for the programs we work on every day. We, collectively, the folks at this conference and more, represent the largest and most focused coalition of organizations for USDA's rural housing service programs and for HUD's rural housing and economic development programs. As such, I firmly believe we've got a responsibility to work with the federal agencies as partners and allies. Like we talked about yesterday with Chairwoman Waters and Majority Whip Clyburn, we all want the programs to do more, perform better, solve the challenges facing rural families in need. And we heard the previous day on Wednesday from USDA Secretary Vilsack and HUD Secretary Fudge. When we talked to them, they said these programs are only as successful as we, the practitioners and local groups, can make them. So our success is their success, as Secretary Vilsack said, and we're ultimately the ones building, owning, financing, managing USDA's and HUD programs. We're the ones training, counseling, directly serving the families that live in the homes. So let's get as much out of today as we can, as much out of these last few hours together as we can as well. Don't forget to make a couple more connections, get into Conference Central or use the chat boxes. We all do way better over the coming months and years when we're connected and doing it together. And I got to say, one of the best ways to do that is to get in coalition with other rural housers. And I mean that literally. The National Rural Housing Coalition started about the same time as HAC. We've already celebrated our 50th. For that, it launched and remains as a group of rural community activists, public officials, nonprofit housing developers, all getting together to fight for better housing and community facilities for low-income rural families. We come together regularly to inform policy, definitely to influence Congress, and really to support each other. So if you aren't a member of the coalition, chop, giddy up, let's go. It's high time you sign up. And we are joined today by the coalition's Bob Rapoza, a great friend of HAC and the rural housing industry writ large. Bob has a couple of decades in DC as one of the most knowledgeable and influential voices on rural housing service programs. He's joining us today to give us a rundown on recent legislative activity and what's in store on the Hill in the coming months. It's not a small list. It's a big list. There's a lot going on. So tune in, pay attention. And Bob, it's a real pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much, David. And it's great to be with you. Congratulations to HAC on what appears to be a very good conference. So thank you again for this invitation. As David said, I'm with the National Rural Housing Coalition, which is a national membership organization. You can go to the next slide. That lobbies on behalf of rural housing policies and programs. The coalition is 51 years old, so it's somewhat older than HAC, and HAC has been a member and a driving force of the coalition since it was started. So I wanted to go through sort of where things stand with Congress. There's a lot that's going on, and first of all, Congress did pass last night a continuing resolution to keep the doors open on the federal government through February the 18th. This agreement, which was passed very quickly, actually took several weeks for Congress to come to. And the argument was over the end date. And the reason for that is that the Democrats in Congress have and in the House in particular, have passed a series of appropriation bills which increase domestic spending by about 16%. They do not increase defense by that much. And there is great reluctance on the part of the Republicans in Congress to go with those levels of funding. So this delay did reflect the fact that the Republicans in Congress are in no rush to complete action on the 22 bills. And while they do have until February, until mid-February to complete action, it could well be that the outcome is a continuing resolution for the rest of this fiscal year, which is something that many Republicans in the Congress would favor. The other item which Congress is working on is Build Back Better. It passed the House just before Thanksgiving. And that, of course, is the president's social spending program, for lack of a better term. That bill is now pending before the Senate. The Senate has had a hard time in completing action on several bills. They are stalled at the moment on defense. The debt limit is scheduled to expire by December 15th. So there is some concern that the Senate might not get to Build Back Better before Christmas and would push all of this into next year. So let me talk about the appropriation bills first. The House has passed the Ag bill. We can go to the next slide. And the Senate has reported their version of the bill. And as you can see, there is a general movement upward, maybe not as much as we would like, but for 502 loans, for 515, for MPR, for 504, there is some movement upward, and that is also the case for water sewer, which is on the following slide. The important thing is that there is a general view from both houses that agriculture bill probably ought to get done, and I think of the bills that have a potential to be finished, the ag bill is certainly in that category. Whether it gets done is I think to some extent a function of the larger politics, but there is general movement upward, and that is important. And we have built in both the House and the Senate good bipartisan support for rural housing programs. The HUD bill has been passed by the House, has not been taken up in the Senate yet. That bill again shows the general movement upward after several years of budget cuts and disappointment on the HUD side. You can see that that the House passed bill has substantial increases in it for home and CDBG and housing counseling. The Senate bill, which was prepared by Senate Democrats only, has some increases, but not to the extent that the House bill has. So all of these bills, all of the 13 bills that Congress has to take up to fund the federal government, they will be hanging fire through mid February, and then we'll have to see what Congress does, whether the House and the Senate can come together for the compromise bills and get these bills through, probably on an omnibus basis, or whether we end up with a continuing resolution for the rest of this fiscal year. So let me just go to the next slide and talk for a second on what President Biden and the Democrats are trying to do. So I've been at this for quite some time, as is obvious from the way that I look. And from the time I get started on this through this year, with few exceptions, the trend has been for budget cuts, for tax breaks for the wealthy, and for defense spending. And President Biden, through what he's gotten done and what he's proposed to do, has taken a far different tack. And if this all gets done, and that's the open, and what is left is Build Back Better, he will have gotten through Congress over $4 trillion in spending aimed at trying to help communities and help people. And that is quite a change from what I've seen in my career with the coalition. So let me talk about some of the details on the Build Back Better. So Build Back Better, the housing title of the bill calls for a substantial increase in federal housing programs and community development programs. I'm sure that Congressman Waters discussed that when you heard from her, and it is quite a thing that she's done by proposing $175 billion for federal housing programs. With regard to rural housing, the bill has roughly $2 billion in budget authority for rural housing programs. And let me just say that if you look over the last 20 years on Section 502 loans, on 515, on self-help housing, on farm labor housing, those programs over the last 20 years have been cut by 60%. And as a result, we have very little production for affordable housing for rural communities. And Build Back Better and the rural housing title for Build Back Better would add $1.8 billion for the preservation and the construction of farm labor and rural rental housing, plus funding for home repair and home ownership. And this is budget authority, not the program level. So, for example, the $1.8 that the bill has for the rental housing programs would convert to $3 billion in the program levels. So this is a very big thing that Congress has, that the House has done, and these provisions were developed with the Senate Banking Committee staff also on the Democratic side. So I am hoping that we will be able to get this through when the Senate finally takes up the Build Back Better bill. Let me just go forward now to HUD provisions to rural development, and these provisions included funding for water sewer, a substantial investment for fixing the lead pipe problem, a rural partnership fund, which I guess would be very helpful for building the capacity of rural communities to solve problems and to better work with federal and state government, and technical support to go with that. All very important for trying to restore and revitalize rural communities. On the HUD side, so for the coalition, we are obviously going to support this. We think this is a great move. We are trying to persuade the Senate and the Congress to add some funding for rental assistance, which would be very helpful in both the preservation and the construction of affordable housing. We are very interested in trying to get some of the home ownership funding of $150 million for Section 502 loans, for direct loans, which we think is the best way to provide housing for first-time homeowners. And also, we are trying to lift the cap on Section 504 loans grants. So that's what we are working on. We will see how that goes, but regardless, this is an important investment in federal rural housing programs. Build Back Better also does a good deal with regard to HUD funding, including funding for homes, the trust fund, CDBG, and tribal communities, and all of that has been passed by the House. A couple of other points that are important: the CDFI funds, which has done housing through the Magnet Fund, has $920 million for that. That's on the following slide. And lastly, the Build Back Better bill that passed the House does provide a substantial increase for LIHTC, 10% a year for 4 years, as well as a new tax credit financing fund for home buyers, which would be run by state housing finance agencies. So we we are surely on the cusp of something very, very good. The president and the Democrats in the House deserve the credit for getting it this far, and we plan to continue to work with the Senate to get this over the finish line at some point soon. So I will pause there. I think I'm just about out of time, and thank you again to HAC for this opportunity.
We're not hearing you. Terry, we're not hearing you.
I have actually suffered the dreaded mute, the dreaded mute button. So thank you, Bob. As David mentioned earlier, membership in the coalition, it's important for rural housing practitioners around the country. If you've not already subscribe to membership of the coalition, now's a great opportunity to do that. We very much appreciate Bob and the coalition's participation in the conference this morning. So with that said, we are going to move on into what is one of the most important parts of our agenda. That is nuts and bolts, the HUD and USDA joint address. And so over the years, nuts and bolts has always symbolized an important part of our program, mainly because many in the field don't always have access to the individuals in policymaking positions that can answer questions and respond to challenges significant to the success of your programs. Admittedly, the time is limited, but you don't often get the chance to speak directly to the people who can help and have them hear firsthand the challenges and impacts that they can have, that the programs can have in your communities. This is the opportunity to do that. We'll first start by hearing brief policy overview statements from the leadership from each agency, and then we'll move directly into sessions where you have the opportunity to ask questions of and hear directly from specific program leadership and staff. So first up, joining us from the Department of Agriculture, I have the distinct privilege of introducing the Honorable Xochitl Torres Small, Undersecretary for Rural Development. Before joining Rural Development, Undersecretary Small was a United States representative for the 5th largest district in the country, the first woman and person of color to represent New Mexico's 2nd Congressional District. Having been raised in the borderlands of New Mexico, the granddaughter of farm workers, Undersecretary Torres Small returned home after college to work as a field organizer, working in colonias in southern New Mexico, collaborating with local grassroots leaders, business owners, elected officials, and regional and state economic development officials to help communities rebound from the Great Depression. During the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, she kept a rural hospital from closing its doors, improved constituent access to healthcare over the phone, and helped secure tens of millions of dollars for broadband in New Mexico through USDA's Reconnect program. Prior to the pandemic, Undersecretary Torres Small raised the alarm on broadband disparities as part of the Rural Broadband Task Force and as an original co-sponsor of the Accessible Affordable Internet for All Act. As a member of the House Agriculture Committee, she helped champion the needs of dairy farmers and sponsored legislation to help local producers in rural communities invest in infrastructure to navigate new markets. Throughout her career, Undersecretary Torres Small has used her experience working in vulnerable rural communities to achieve lasting investments that combat persistent poverty. Please help me give a warm virtual welcome to the Honorable Xochitl Torres Small.
Wow, Terry, thank you so much for that incredible introduction. And I'm just so honored to get to be here with incredible housing practitioners and visionaries for this work. Thank you so much for allowing me to join you and to have this opportunity to connect virtually. It's always good to be with friends, and I know we share so many goals and priorities, including keeping the Rural Partnership Program in the Build Back Better legislation. I'm so deeply grateful for your support on that front. It was truly invaluable, and I appreciate how well you not only understand the importance of that program, but you live and practice the values of place-based strategy and homegrown service every single day. Now, here's something else we both understand. I get that when it comes to community development, it often feels like housing gets ignored. But the truth is that housing is a cornerstone for all other development. I saw that firsthand growing up near Colonias in southern New Mexico. In high school, I had classmates who had trouble getting to school after severe rain because the dirt roads would regularly flood. But come hell or high water, they'd find a way to get to school. Later, as a U.S. representative for the region, I saw how housing developments can help build better drainage systems. I've also spoken with parents who couldn't keep their homes warm in the winter due to skyrocketing propane costs. And some of those parents literally built their own solution through the self-help housing program. I also met some of those same new homeowners who used the skills they learned from that self-help housing program to start landscaping businesses of their own. Just recently, I had another experience in the Colonias in Texas that reinforced my sense of the work that you all do as nonprofit connectors. I was speaking with one of our own loan specialists who identified nonprofit connectors and the work that you do in housing and beyond to build relationships. And that becomes outreach that then increases capacity, not just for our housing programs, but for all of the community development work that we do. I've seen that when housing is addressed, other infrastructure needs get addressed too. Housing is a catalyst for other essential community improvements like water, sewage, and broadband. It can be a springboard for people too, providing the security necessary to support learning and entrepreneurship, and in so doing, laying the foundation for future success. One of the reasons I'm so proud to serve in this position is because rural development is such a large, if sometimes quiet, partner in rural communities when it comes to housing. Our support for housing protects people from homelessness, and it makes buying or renting a home truly affordable. We make sure that seniors and the most vulnerable Americans have a roof over their heads, including during a pandemic. Our programs recently rose to the occasion of the COVID pandemic, for example, by providing extra rental assistance to those who are paying more than 30% of their income in rent. Now, it's critical that we work together to make sure these programs have a future. Going forward, I'm eager to continue to invest in this foundational work. That means investing in the physical infrastructure of affordable single and multifamily homes across rural America. That means making sure our programs work for you, the on-the-ground builders who know your communities best. I'm reminded by the example, most recently, I think Secretary Vilsack mentioned it, of the Native CDFI work in South Dakota, reaching people through partnerships and trust in local solutions that USDA may never have reached on its own. This work also means supporting your work as community connectors. It makes me think of your evolution in the midst of the housing market crash to recognize the deep work ahead. Instead of hunkering down on the new barriers to affordable housing, you expanded your wings, investing time in capacity building and technical assistance and financial education. I'm struck by how the fundamental work of putting people in homes was one of the best ways to build the trust necessary for larger community investment. I recently spoke to a housing partner in Laredo whose daughter's roommate asked her one night, "What's credit?" This was a smart young woman who had worked hard to get into college and earn a scholarship, but she was still at risk of being locked out of countless opportunities because she lacked basic financial information. Rural development is investing in financial education through your work to make sure hardworking people like this college student don't get blocked out by the system. I'm excited to work with you in this effort. Before I take your questions, I want to thank you all again for your incredible support for keeping the Rural Partnership Program in the Build Back Better bill. You were willing to show how important community stakeholders are and how RD should invest in them. Your partnership means a great deal to me, and I look forward to working with you to make sure housing isn't ignored, and instead it's seen and treated as the cornerstone of community development that it is. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Eileen Neely. I am HAC's Director of Lending. And to continue the nuts and bolts session, it is my honor to introduce Todd Richardson. Todd is the General Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy Development and Research at HUD. That's a lot of words. What does that mean? Well, basically, Todd is the Lance George of HUD. He heads up HUD's research arm that manages all national surveys, conducts research, analyzes data, and performs program evaluation. PD&R, as Todd's office is affectionately known, since it wouldn't be a day in housing if you didn't learn a new acronym. They use all their research to inform the HUD policy development and implementation. That's really critical. So it's really evidence-based policy making that's happening at HUD. So HUD's research agenda is vast. It's from community development and place-based initiatives like the use and effectiveness of CDBG. It's to housing finance and affordable housing supply. But perhaps the most interesting to this audience is HUD's research agenda does include Indian and rural issues, including rural homelessness, disaster preparedness, and adaptation strategies for housing in Indian country. So lots of good stuff that Todd's group is doing, and I will just go ahead and turn it over to Todd to share more about his work, his team's work, and what they're doing, what they're learning, and how it's impacting our programs.
Thank you, Eileen, for having me and for that introduction. It's great to be with you today. David is an old friend, and I'm always honored to be invited to this conference. I've already learned a lot from Undersecretary Torres Small. And as an aside, actually, one of my daughters is in college in Socorro, New Mexico, so I've been there. It's a beautiful place. From HUD, I bring greetings from Secretary Marcia Fudge and Deputy Secretary Adrian Todman. I've gotten to spend some time with both, and they are a powerful 1-2 combination here at HUD. A few years ago, HUD paid me to take an expensive executive training program at Harvard. I remember just one thing from that training, and that is if you want a broad audience to remember what you have to say, just make one point. If you happen to make 4 or more points, no one's in your audience is going to remember anything you said. So my one point, and that's the same thing you've heard from others here, is that we have a lot of money that is coming our way to address housing. In fact, a lot has already been appropriated. There's a lot of need for these resources, and they are very desperately needed. But for these resources to be effective, they depend on the capacity of your communities to effectively implement them. In our nuts and bolts session, I hope to hear from you on what you think we could be doing to help enhance the capacity in your communities to make the effective use of these funds. So that's my one point. If you care to take notes for the rest of my presentation, I have some details that might be interesting to reinforce that point. But just for fun, and because I believe in fun, I'm going to open with a factoid from the American Housing Survey. In the 2017 American Housing Survey, we asked folks to describe where they live, urban, suburban, or rural. And because this is in the AHS, we can cross-tab this response with all sorts of interesting housing questions. So I get this question all the time. How many HUD-assisted tenants live in rural areas? And I usually say how many HUD-assisted tenants are in non-metro areas. But because of this survey, I can say, well, how many of our HUD-assisted tenants actually think they live in a rural area? So you will be the first people to hear this answer. Well, after myself and Brad Pollack, who prepared these remarks, and Emily Molfino, who did this analysis, and the Census Bureau Disclosure Review Board. But after them, you're the first people to hear this answer. So 6% of public housing tenants, 8% of housing choice voucher tenants, and 7% of tenants in HUD multifamily assisted say they live in rural places. And among unassisted very low-income renters, 12% say they live in rural places. Now, to the meat of my presentation, the details of the housing assistance that's in our coronavirus coronavirus relief bills and the outlook on foreclosures and evictions, and forthcoming money, fingers crossed, in the Build Back Better as it relates to rural housing in the HUD bill. So in terms of CARES Act that passed in the early days of the pandemic in March 2020, $12.4 billion was allocated to HUD. That included $5 billion in our CDBG CV to help states address the virus, $4 billion for our Emergency Solutions Grant Program for addressing homeless issues, and another $1.25 billion for tenant-based rental assistance and $300 billion to Native American housing and community development assistance. So now it's a year and a half since CARES, and as of yesterday, more than 98% of that money had been obligated, but just 42.5% had been spent. This, of course, varies by program. For instance, our rental assistance funding is entirely expended, but there's still 35% of the Native American money that's still to be spent. So the key takeaway here is a majority of our HUD CARES Act funding still remains to be spent. With the American Rescue Plan, or ARP, that passed this past March, that meant another $10.7 billion for HUD programs. And that includes $5 billion for 70,000 emergency housing vouchers that are being used through a unique partnership with PHAs and continuums of care. In addition, it has $740 million in Native American housing and community development block grant funding, and nearly $5 billion for a special home allocation intended to develop housing for homeless. Now, as of now, much of the ARP has not been spent. 59% of the funding is designated that has been designated has been obligated, but only 5% has been expended so far. So, in terms of our ARP funding, nearly all of it has yet to be spent. So, even before we have this influx of this likely influx of Build Back Better funding, and I'm going to get to that in a little bit, there's billions of dollars in assistance still spending from the coronavirus relief bills, which is why I'm hyper focused on hearing from you about our capacity building, how we can help with capacity building. So a couple of other things to note in addition to those funds is we've recently received $5 billion for disaster relief. So for some select communities, we're doing some substantial allocations of disaster recovery funds for disasters that occurred in 2020 and 2021. And also, while not a HUD program, it's impossible to talk about housing relief during the pandemic without talking about the Emergency Rental Assistance Program being run by the Department of Treasury. That program has $46 billion from a couple of appropriations, including ARP, and it is intended to prevent evictions. As of the end of October, over $13 billion has been provided to assist over 2.5 million households under that program. So that's very impressive. But a key takeaway here is that $33 billion in EREB funds remain to be spent. So there's still a lot of resources in that program. And we need it. Okay, so I'll get back to what I'm good at, which is the data piece. All this assistance is needed. We are not yet through this awful pandemic, and people continue to struggle with housing payments. Rents are rising fast in many places, making it even more difficult for folks. My 14-year-old was told yesterday that he has to attend school remotely again because of a COVID outbreak at his school, even though he is vaccinated. So as a parent, if you can't work remotely, what do you do? So each month, the Census Bureau puts out what they call the Pulse Survey, and included in that are questions on whether people believe they'll be able to make their next rent payment and whether they fear eviction in the next 2 months. In January 2020, there were an estimated 8.7 million renters answering no when asked whether they made their last month's rent payment on time. And that was the highest point during the pandemic. That dropped to 6.2 million by the end of March, but ever since it has remained stubbornly at that level, with the most recent October estimate coming in at 6.9 million renters reporting having missed their last payment. On average, they were 2.5 months behind on rent. 14% were 6 or more months behind on rent. We estimate there's about $18 billion in back-owed rent. 3/4 of those reporting being behind on rent had incomes of $35,000 or less. And on the question of whether renters felt likely to face eviction within the next 2 months, 4.2 million renters had answered yes to that question in January. It fell to just 3 million by the end of March, but has remained stuck at that level ever since, with the most recent October survey coming in at 3.1 million saying they're fearing eviction. So that brings me to the Build Back Better, the elephant in the room. And I appreciate Bob's earlier presentation about the legislative status. As it stands now, and obviously this could change, HUD is in line for more than $150 billion in new funding. But you have to remember that's over 10 years, so around $15 billion a year. HUD's annual budget is about $60 billion, so we're talking about expanding HUD's budget by roughly 25% from our baseline over the next decade through Build Back Better. So that's a lot of money, and it requires implementation and good implementation. So a question that a lot of folks in the housing world are probably thinking as this comes together is, when are you going to see that new money? So I like to draw the distinction between fast money and slow money. In Build Back Better, there's about $53 billion for HUD and what I'll call fast money. This is the money that goes to programs that are based on pre-existing formulas and rules like the Community Development Block Grant System or Public Housing Capital Fund and Home Program. So these are programs where we're just going to run it through the formula. It's going to go to the grantees, and they can run it under the current rules. So by increasing these programs by $1 billion will mean we can move quickly with these funds. But we're still going to need more staff, more technical assistance staff, and our grantees on the field are going to need more capacity to implement. But it's easier money for us to get out. Then there's the other $111 billion for HUD, which I'll call the slower money. It means that funding needs to go through a competitive process or involve new programs that need new formulas and regulatory setup. That can take years in some cases. So while that funding will certainly help once it goes out, it's not the money you should be planning for today. You should be planning for that fast money. Now let me talk about how BBB might impact rural areas. In Build Back Better, there is a set aside for CDBG funds with a new formula to provide $700 million for colonias. I want to do a shout out for the HAC research team. When BBB was coming together and we needed to determine what the colonias program should look like, we had a recently completed HAC study to help us. And on that same note, I take the opportunity to plug an article written by HAC Stuff on colonias in our latest quarterly issue of Cityscape. You can get on HUDuser.gov. So thank you very much to HAC's research team for that. There's also a new competitive $500 million program providing CDBG funding for manufactured home communities. And that may be particularly helpful in rural areas. Going back to the AHS data I mentioned earlier, more than 60% of people who live in manufactured or mobile homes report that they live in a rural area. The bigger pots of funds are also available for rural areas. One of our biggest is $63 billion in public housing funding, some of which will go to rural areas, which will help finally make a big dent in the backlog of repairs and in some cases reconstruction of public housing. And as my factoid at the beginning noted, if 6% of public housing tenants say they live in rural areas, 6% of $63 billion is about $3.8 billion. Another couple of programs getting quite a boost, even if not all goes to rural housing, are the Housing Trust Fund and the Home Program, which get $15 billion and $10 billion respectively. And that's fast money. That's coming out by formula. The trust fund money goes directly to the states, and 40% of the Home Program money does as well. So that's a big pool of money that state and local governments will be able to draw on in those rural areas. Tribal areas were among the hardest hit by the pandemic, so it's good to see over $1 billion go to those communities and Build Back Better, as well as $11 billion in the recently passed infrastructure bill. Plenty of other new programs could have an impact too, even if they're not as targeted to rural areas, like the more than $13 billion for first-generation home buyers. Now, of course, I've gone through all these dollar figures. With Build Back Better, it's all subject to what ends up in the final bill, so hopefully we'll find out answers to that in coming weeks and months. I'll close with one last program that I know is important to the Housing Assistance Council, and that's Section 4 funding. With all those billions of dollars I just described coming down the pike, whatever coronavirus, disaster relief, infrastructure, or Build Back Better, the capacity to actually implement it is going to be really vital, not just at HUD, but in local governments and nonprofits. Build Back Better has a lot of funding for technical assistance and community capacity building, so organizations like HAC are going to be very important for building and capacity building. Section 4 is funded at $41 million this fiscal year, and of that, $5 million must be used by its recipients for rural community activities. Additionally, there is rural capacity building program funded at $5 million level for this fiscal year, for which all the activities must go forward in rural communities. So before I wrap up, this final brain teaser factoid from the American Housing Survey. Now, a majority of residents of non-metropolitan areas consider where they live to be rural. That makes sense. However, a majority of the people saying they live in rural areas live within a metropolitan area. So I'll let you chew on that for our nuts and bolts conversation. Stephen Washington, Director of CPD's Office of Policy Development and Coordination, and Iyata Green, Supervisor of the Grants Management Team in that office, can provide more details about rural capacity building in Section 4 during the nuts and bolts session that's coming up next. With that, I'll hand it back to Eileen, and if there's any Q's and A's.
Thanks to both Undersecretary Torres Small and General Deputy Assistant Secretary Todd Richardson for joining us this morning. We do have just a few questions here in the chat, and I will see if I can quickly pull some up. The first question is for you, Undersecretary Torres Small. Over the last few years, RD has increasingly relied on credit scores when determining eligibility for 504 loans. I certainly understand that repayment is important, but given there are baked-in inequities in credit scoring and most often penalize folks who have been historically marginalized, the emphasis on credit scores could have the unintended effect of serving fewer BIPOC and other marginalized groups. Is RD monitoring the demographics of whom is served by the 504 program?
I just want to thank the person for raising that. It's certainly something we're paying close attention to, both in terms of the credit scores, the evaluation, the process, the application process itself, as well as other unintended consequences. For example, what it takes to do 504 repair loans on a mobile home, for example, to make sure that everyone has access to a program. To the program. So we are monitoring that closely and evaluating how to take the next best steps in order to address the equity challenges within 504 program.
All right. Thank you. Let's see, there's a question for you, Todd. Can you please say more about the HUD Disaster Recovery Funds? Who can apply? What are eligible uses? And where can we find out more about the disaster relief?
So the disasters in 2020 that we funded, there's a number of them all over the country. That I just was on a call earlier today with Puerto Ricans about their earthquake that was in 2020 on their allocation. But that information we have a press release that we put out showing all the different jurisdictions that got funding in 2020 for the disasters. You know, the big hurricanes in Louisiana and in Alabama. A lot of rural areas hit hard. So we've pushed out, I think, about $2 billion at the end of October, and we still have $3 billion more to push out for 2021 disasters that'll include Hurricane Ida. So a lot of money coming that way. But you can see that we have a press release on it at HUD.gov that you can see the jurisdictions.
All right. Thank you so much. So this is a really good one. USDA Multifamily Preservation, it is a big priority for us here at HAC and our stakeholders. And so we would love to hear more about how RD hopes to utilize that critical funding.
Oh, I just so appreciate that effort, because as we recapitalize with multifamily places, there's an opportunity to continue that affordable rental assistance. But in addition to that, we do see that our infrastructure is getting older. And so we're trying to explore ways to increase funding, but also use the funding that's available for new developments. So we have identified opportunities to expand some of the funding to make it available for new building in addition to repairs.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And this is a question. Looks like from they're rolling a little bit fast here. This question is for Todd. Let's see. Claudia Shea wants to know if you could say just maybe a bit about the delay between allocation and designation of funds there at HUD.
Well, you know, it's always a process here with these funds. Like the allocations, if we're doing it by formula, the allocations are the easy part in many ways. You got to do a notice that sets out what the requirements are of the program. And this is why I talked about this issue about fast and slow money. If we don't have to do a notice about how the money can be spent, you've already got rules. You can just start spending that money right away. The other big issue, of course, is at the local level or at the state level is that if we're suddenly giving you twice as much or 3 times or 10 times as much money as you usually get under that program, you don't have the capacity to operate that right away. You've got to build the capacity, and that slows things down, which is why, my big concern right now is how can we get, what can we do to help enhance capacity for the local governments, for the nonprofits that have to implement these, that will be implementing these programs. We're slated to get quite a bit of money under Build Back Better for technical assistance, for capacity building, and we want to figure out how to make those resources as effective as possible.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that, Todd. It looks like there are a few questions, but they look more maybe program specific. So unless folks have other questions that you want to quickly populate there in the chat box, looking one last time. Oh, there's a question, another question for you, Todd. Will there be additional funding for the Section 202 program?
Build Back Better has more money for 202. It also has more money for 811.
All right. Last question, and this one goes to Undersecretary Torres Small. Will USDA be establishing new programs that groups are able to apply to directly, or will the new funds be used to only enhance the existing programs?
In Build Back Better, there's a little bit of both. And I love Todd's explanation of slow money versus fast money. So there's fast money that will go to existing programs, and that's exciting. Although there will be some additional requirements that Congress has posed on some of that faster money. And then when it comes to new programs, the Rural Partnership Program is a key example of that, that would fund more intentional, collaborative, place-based investments by supporting local connectors, nonprofit connectors, like so many of you all who participate in HAC, who already have strong relationships with communities to help expand that investment in those communities and that capacity building. Another example of likely a new program that we created is one that Bob mentioned when it comes to lead remediation. And that will be through the water program, through WEP, but just another flag for rural development and creating a new program there.
Thank you so much. I know I promised that was the last question, but there's one question for the both of you as we head out into the breakouts. How do USDA and HUD plan to stay coordinated in this administration?
I'll let the Undersecretary answer first.
That's such a great question. And it certainly has been a priority within the administration to make sure that all departments of the federal government are working together. So there are interagency work groups. There are also intentional collaborations that happen both on a specific area or more generally. But so for one example of that, because sometimes it can really get into the weeds, but one example of that is that we're participating with Secretary Fudge looking at appraisals and how appraisals can impact equity in rural areas and across the country. And we've been invited to participate as rural development to really show that rural perspective when it comes to how appraisals can impact equity. So that's one example of an interagency group that is really working with HUD. I think another example is there's an interagency working group on child safety that both rural development and HUD are partners on to advance that work.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't think I can answer it any better. Thank you, Undersecretary.
All right. So those are all the questions that we have this morning. Please join me in thanking both Undersecretary Torres Small and General Deputy Assistant Secretary Todd Richardson for joining us. We are headed into the nuts and bolts breakout this morning. Those breakouts start directly at 12:15. We're up first with the HUD breakout, and then we're going to follow immediately with the USDA breakout. So don't go anywhere. Stay with us as we head off into the nuts and bolts breakouts. Thank you again.